So it's come to my attention recently that there are people out there claiming that, from a technical standpoint, keeping a game playable after support ends just isn't feasible. Now, I've seen a lot of coverage on this, but no one's really talking about what I think is the most interesting part of that. Is that even true? How would you have to change how you design your video games from a programmatic standpoint in order to actually decouple them from the server once you're done supporting them? That's what I want to talk about today, and hopefully by the time this video is done, you will have a better understanding of what the technical implication of this law is and how hard it would actually be to implement for developers. Because I personally believe that explaining technical limitations is a lot better than just saying, no, it can't be done. Now, before I actually start, there's two things that I feel I need to say. First, I fully support this movement. Just because I'm talking about the actual struggles that implementing some of these systems would be and what they entail does not mean that I'm against them having to do the work. I just want people to actually understand what it would take. The second thing is, what are my credentials here? How do you know that I actually know what I'm talking about? Well, I've been programming since I was 15, and I've been a full stack developer now for 5 years. I've configured numerous servers, I've taken applications from concept to launch. I've done this stuff for a long time as my main job. And just recently I wanted to move to YouTube because I really enjoy talking about game design and explaining these concepts that I'm passionate about, and I want to give this a real try. But the more important part of this is that if I do say something wrong, by all means, please check me on it. I'm of the belief that no matter how experienced you are as a developer or programmer or whatever, you still don't know everything. There's just too much in this industry for one person to do that. I'm fairly confident that my information is right just based on the research that I did before making this video and how it relates to what I've had to build in the past. But if I make a mistake, I will own up to it and discuss it. So let's talk about what is, in my opinion, the easiest type of game to decouple from the server. It makes no sense that the games even stop functioning without a server. They don't even need a server. And that is for games that are server-side save state validated. That's a very big word just to say, when you save your game, instead of it being stored in your local file system, the data is stored on some external server. And to demonstrate how this works, I feel like for no reason in particular, the best way to do it is to use Microsoft Paint. So give me a second. Now, I've never used MS Paint before, so first things first, what is a game server? And that's something that I feel like there's a lot of mysticism around, but it's actually very simple. All that a server is software that is running on a computer. It could be any computer. It could be your computer. It's just software that is running, just like Discord or Steam. And what that software does is it lets other people connect to your computer. That's it. So when people talk about a game server, all that you're actually doing is you are having your game hit somebody else's computer that is storing or giving some type of data to your game. And the extent of that varies by game, but the most basic type of server validation that can lock a game out of being playable is twofold. Either save data validation, or more insidiously and much more frustrating, is server check validation, or online check validation. Basically, when you code, you can make a line on just the very start of your game trying to start up of just hit server, hit serve. And if that fails, you can just fail. You can just throw an error code at your user. This type of validation is, well, completely stupid. If you're doing this, you are just actively trying to prevent your game from being playable for effectively no real reason. But the much more logical reason why a game would do this is save state validation, right? Because back in the day, when you would save a game, you would save it to your local files, or even if we go further back, a memory card. All that local file saves do is they create some sort of file, like just a single file, like all of these are files, right? And that file has information that just kind of tells you where the player is. And the form of that data, you can create however you want, really. You could save the exact coordinates, game state, everything, or you could make save points, which is what a lot of developers do because it's easier, of, hey, when you save at the save point, it records your time played, your current inventory, and the current game state, usually based off of flags, which, flags are like, did this event happen? Yes or no. What is the reason why you would look at these local file saves and go, we don't want those in our game? Well, that's actually pretty simple. When you allow local file saves to dictate the player's current state of the game, that means that they can give themselves items or progress that they don't actually have. Imagine if, for instance, in Helldivers 2, I could go find a file and just change my level to 600. That wouldn't really be fair for most players, would it? That would break the integrity of the game. What about all the DLC that you can buy in that game? So instead of saving to local files, which is the original way of doing things back before multiplayer was as big as it is, people started saving to their own server. So now, when you boot up your game, instead of checking local files and using that to validate, what people do is they have the game, send your Steam ID, send your PlayStation ID, whatever, and they hit their game server, and then they hit back, and they say, here is what you have. Here's what you're currently doing. And then they'll rely on that server as well whenever you complete a mission to make sure that the rewards from that mission are fair. So how hard would it be to decouple a game such as The Crew 2 or even Helldivers from this system? Well, pretty easy, because what you need to understand is the type of data, or at least it should be pretty easy, but the type of data that a game server and your local files provide can be the same thing. It's just data in the proper format for your game to parse and know this is what they have, this is where they are. So if you initially program your game such that it can make local file saves, and then you don't rely on them or use them unless the game servers are down. And you could even go beyond that, right? Because sometimes you want your game servers to have maintenance. And also by enabling this system, right, of having a local file save, it means that malicious actors could, theoretically, have an easier time accessing your game content that they didn't pay for by spoofing the data and then running it in offline mode. So the easiest way for a game such as Helldivers to make sure that your progress is always real and always fair is to do an online check and a save state check combined. So they check if you can hit the servers. If not, they'd say, hey, servers are currently down, please wait. Completely fine for a game that is going to come back. And then they'll do a save state validation check. So even if you modify your local files, the server will look at your data and go, that's not right, that's not valid. Getting rid of the online check should be as simple as disabling a function. So on your init, what you do is basically on game startup, can we hit the server? If no, maintenance mode, main. If yes, the game launches. Easy. If you go into that init and you say, hey, you don't need to care about if the game server is there anymore, well, then it says, well, how do I check for the saved data of the player? And you can say local files. For Helldivers in particular, there is a lot of work that they would need to do to fully decouple the game from the server. But for The Crew, a much simpler game, it really should have been as simple as getting rid of this online check and then having a backup save file that can tell your game, this is what I have. The interesting thing is, you don't even need to be having active game servers to do DLC. Steam, as well as PlayStation, I believe, but I know for a fact Steam, can actually validate that somebody has or does not have access to downloadable content. Now, if you don't have any server validation, local file modification can still cheat that. But if your game is already not supported, well, I mean, bad actors are going to be bad actors. I don't think it's fair to say, well, because someone could pirate my game if I decoupled server access, I'm going to remove my game for everybody. If you're not making money on it anyway, why not leave it up, still have it in a purchasable state, and just accept that some people are going to pirate it? It's the difference between no money and some. Now, that is by far the easiest type of game to just get rid of the server on. It would take probably a day of dev time, up to a week if no one's touched the code in forever and it does these checks in really weird places. But assuming that you program this well, like one function does the check and handles booting you to menu if it's not valid, this shouldn't be too hard. So let's talk about my second type of game. Games that are mostly local but server tied. So I talked about Helldivers earlier. That's because I wanted to go there. What's interesting about Helldivers is that the missions themselves are actually client-side, but the missions that can be generated are tied to the server. The planets that are open, the progress that's saved, all of that is server tied. But the actual act of running a mission, the act of having missions be generated, like that is client side. Players don't have the same missions. Instead, there's a system that creates random deviation, and the random deviation that is currently allowed is tied to the server. So for games like these, games with event quests, games that are heavy on a server to tell you what's going on, how do you actually decouple that? Well, now we're looking at what I would call server spoofs. Yeah, sure, that's great. So what's a server spoof? Well, now, instead of accessing somebody's computer directly, which would be the initial game server, you access something that is offline, stored in your local files, but emulates the action of a server. This means that you can go fully offline, no longer updating your game, and still have a content rotation and a playable game. Now, is it going to be as good as the live service game was? No, of course not. You don't have any control over it. It's going to be based on existing parameters, but a lot of roguelikes can functionally be a good look at this system. The game Slay the Spire has different seeds, different generations, different things that can happen every single time based on unchanging logic. Making this game be playable offline in its current state would likely be a pretty massive undertaking. Also, multiplayer would be cooked, but the bill only calls for the games to be playable, not for them to be fully functional. Get rid of the server, make a spoof, maybe let people access private servers, but we'll talk about those when we get there. And you could have a pretty functional game, I'd say pretty quickly. It would be a big burden to do this retroactively. But if you knew from conception that your game needed to be able to work offline eventually, it wouldn't be impossible. God, I feel like I'm gonna have to cut so much from this section of the video because I kept kind of talking in circles here, but hey, cut me some slack. This is my first time trying this type of video. Now for what is probably the biggest part of the discussion that is the most misunderstood. Remember how I talked earlier about how a game server is just software on someone's computer? Well, let's talk now about a private server. A private server is a game server that you're running on your computer. Easy enough. But how hard is it to actually get a private server running? Well, the problem is, when you have server-side code, right? No client can actually see that code. They only ever actually see what the server sends to them. What that means is that all of the code that handles how your game server is parsing the data that you send to them via your game, is unknown. When you allow for players to create private servers that they're hosting on their own machine, effectively you're releasing the code that your server is using to do stuff. This can have risks. Can. But it depends. In order for a private server to work, devs have to publish their code and protocol, and they need to tell you what type of data the game is expecting from the server. If they don't do this, then players are stuck having to reverse engineer the server and what data it's actually sending. This is obviously a pretty massive undertaking. Now, the problem is, a lot of the time game servers have some pretty risky data on it, such as keys that allow for payment processing, which a key is just a password. I'm not going to get any more into it than that. Sometimes they have other passwords available, or security stuff, and like how you handle security can live on your server. That doesn't mean that you can't safely give people access to a private server. What you need to do is you need to strip out any code that is reliant on payment processor information, specific passwords to specific data stores, and instead make a version that doesn't have any of your personal data in it. Normally, when you design a server, any super secret secure stuff is stored in a separate spot on your computer behind a separate password that people don't even get to see. Just like you don't even get to see it. See, it's here. And the server knows the location and has access to it, but there is no way to actually see what the data is. It's similar to when you type in a password and all you get is a bunch of stars. The computer can see it, but no human being has access to that location. Just the server that is calling on that data. So in order to make a private server launch, you need to make sure that your data is secure, and if any developers didn't properly secure your passwords and stuff, you need to scrub that out. Which also means that you need to make sure that nothing in the code is relying on those secret keys in order to run. Otherwise, people, even if you release your server information, will need to reverse engineer what's missing in order to run it. The other risk, although this is much, much less of a problem if you're already killing the game anyway, is that by showing the back-end code that your server is using to detect cheating, cheating gets a lot easier because now people can literally see what you're looking for and create workarounds. Now, again, if it's this or the game is unplayable, pick your poison, but it's worth mentioning, there are valid reasons why you might not want to release your server code, especially if you plan on reusing that code in a new game going forward. Which, I'll be honest though, the industry practice that I see if developers went the private server route is honestly just stripping out any sensitive code that is there for the sake of your game being better, but isn't necessary. So like if you want to reuse your anti-cheat because it was very effective, just don't include it. And players can reverse engineer their own anti-cheat because by hosting a private server, you now also have effectively opened up the modding community and made your game open source to an extent. Now, does that create licensing issues? I don't know, guys. I'm a programmer. Why would I know about legal stuff? Fine, that's not on me. There is one type of way that a game can get killed that I really have nothing to say on, and that's licensing issue game killing. So for instance, the Deadpool game, that game wasn't taken off the market for any technical server-related issues. It was because the game creators no longer had the license to the character. In instances like that, I just don't really know the solution. I'm curious if there is one even. You know, it's worth mentioning. It's also worth mentioning that as a developer, you can't do anything about that. Like, that's one situation where I feel like you really need to be careful with this law because I don't want the wrong people getting punished for what is a very legal gray area. Now, there is one final game that I want to talk about, and that is the authoritative server type game. These games are frankly in a league of their own when it comes to online dependence. These are games like Valorant, games where the server is king and does everything. But what's different about them? Well, when you play Valorant, you effectively aren't actually playing the game. Because when you make an input, your client assumes that that input will happen. But if it doesn't actually go through to the server, it doesn't. So everything that happens in the game is you seeing what the server is telling you is going on. And if your game desyncs from the server, you just can't actually do anything. So the game in its current build is unplayable unless you're on one of their game servers. Because the way that you actually move around is the server. You just see what the server. You're basically watching a movie of what the server is doing. So the client is just sending input and seeing the result. That's it. You're not playing the game on your machine, which is part of why the game can run on a toaster, because all the complicated stuff is offloaded. You just need graphics. But therein lies the problem. All of the complicated stuff is offloaded. Where a weapon goes when you throw it, that's calculated server side. What happens when you jump, that's calculated server side. When a smoke is placed, that's calculated server side. Everything in the game is running on their servers. Valorant in particular uses 128 tick rate servers, I believe. I'm actually going to look it up. Yes, 128 tick rate servers. In order for a computer to even run that would require some pretty hefty specs. But the much bigger problem isn't the specs, because let's be real, some people could run that. It's the fact that the entire game is basically running on other proprietary software that you'd also need. They've got Vanguard, they've got their matchmaking system, they've got all the stat tracking. Basically, there is so much involved in a game like Valorant that is owned by Riot that isn't actually part of the game, that they'd effectively have to make an entirely new build that worked in a different way with none of their proprietary stuff in it in order for this game to work. The sheer scope of trying to decouple that game from its server is frankly absurd. But luckily for them, you didn't actually pay for their game, did you? So that opens up a new question of, where do microtransactions fall in this? Well, that's something for someone else to figure out. But yeah, games like Valorant, Fortnite, etc., those games which are server authoritative would be extremely hard to rebuild. They also have the teams that are probably the most qualified to do it out of almost anyone. So, would it really be a problem? Not one that I care much for, because multi-billion-dollar corporations can afford this type of stuff. It does mean, though, that smaller dev teams may have a little bit more trepidation when it comes to making a multiplayer shooter. Anyway, that was fun. It was nice to kind of talk more about the dev side of stuff. I apologize if any of this was kind of hard to follow. This is my first time trying to do this style of video. I just felt it was fitting. And hopefully you're walking away from this with kind of an understanding of what this law is actually asking, and I'd say that for most games, no, it is not too much. But especially for games like The Crew, it really should have been base in the first place. The biggest takeaway is that if this law passes, developers will need to, from the onset, have some type of idea for how they're going to make their game work without a server to validate it. And it may just change how games are even made in the first place to lean a little bit more heavily on the client. Still, that's what indie games were for the most part doing anyway, because one or two people, developers, don't have the capability or currency to actually upkeep servers anyway. Look at Lethal Company. That was peer-to-peer. It did great. Now, if he wanted to, he could make dedicated servers, but when you're just starting out, that takes money. Will it affect small businesses? I don't personally think so. I think that anyone who is trying to make a game complex enough that it needs to be always online should also be a good enough developer that they can work around the limitations of that. Now, if you think I'm totally wrong, feel free to disagree. I'm gonna begin editing this because I stuttered and stumbled a lot. Turns out MS Paint is actually super hard to use, and only an extremely smart individual could ever use it to explain anything related to development. So, I'll know better next time. But yeah, that's all from me. I just made a video on difficulty in games that I'm pretty proud of. If you want to check that out, please do. And until next time, see ya. They've got Vanguard, they've got their stat tracking, they've got the matchmaking system. I shouldn't be clapping into the mic.